Part 1. Discarded. She was sent west like a piece of unwanted furniture. No farewell, no blessing, no hand on her shoulder at the door. Just a one-way ticket pressed across the breakfast table by a man who could not look her in the eye while he did it, and two brothers laughing in the kitchen like they had already won something. They thought it was funny. They thought the scarred rancher in Millfield would take one look at Clara Ashford and send her back on the next coach east. They thought she would come home humiliated, broken, finally quiet enough to stop being a problem. They were wrong about almost everything, but they were right about one thing. Clara Ashford did not belong in Dry Hollow, Texas. She never had. The morning she left, the sky was the color of old ash. Not dark enough to be night, not light enough to be day. Just that gray, uncommitted hour before the world decides what it wants to be. Clara stood at the edge of the Ashford property with a canvas traveling bag over one shoulder and listened to the silence of a house that was not mourning her departure. The bag was not full. It did not need to be. There was not much in that house that belonged to her. Two changes of clothes, a broken-handled hairbrush she had repaired herself with a strip of leather, a water tin that had been her mother's dented on one side from a fall. It had taken years before Clara was old enough to remember. She had kept it not for sentiment alone, though sentiment was there. She had kept it because it was the only object in the Ashford house that no one had ever tried to take from her. She adjusted the strap across her shoulder and walked toward the road without looking back. That was the first decision she made that morning. The second was harder. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had been standing in the hallway outside the kitchen with her back flat against the wall and her breathing slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to breathe when she needed to hear something she was not supposed to hear. Brett Ashford's voice carried through walls. It always had. Her oldest brother was not a man built for subtlety. He was broad-shouldered and loud in the specific way of men who have never once been told that their volume was a problem. His laugh came up from his chest and hit the ceiling. His anger was the same way. Everything he felt he broadcast. Dean was different. Dean was the one she had always needed to watch. That evening, Brett had read a letter twice. She heard the paper. She heard the silence between readings. Then she heard him call for Dean, and she heard Dean's boot heels cross the floor, and she did what she had learned to do at age 9. She stayed very still, and she listened. The letter was from a land agent in Millfield, a settlement 3 days west by coach, a man named Harlan Caldwell. It described a rancher looking for a capable woman to help manage a working cattle operation. Not a romantic arrangement, practical, fair terms, a real home and a share in something being built. Brett had found this funnier than anything he had encountered in recent memory. "We could send Clara," Dean said. She could hear the grin in it. She knew that grin. She had spent her life reading the room through walls and closed doors, learning to identify every shade of her brother's moods by sound alone. That particular grin meant he was enjoying the shape of an idea before he had finished forming it. Let this rancher take a look at her and decide what a practical arrangement means when the best you can manage is an Ashford girl. Brett had laughed. The bottle came off the shelf. She heard it open. "She is useless here anyway," Brett said. "Always underfoot. We send her west, tell her it is real pocket the travel reimbursement the agent mentions. He sends her back. We are rid of her for a few weeks either way, and we are a few dollars ahead." A pause. "What if he does not send her back?" Brett's voice went flat and satisfied. "Then we are rid of her for good." They drank to that. Clara stood in the hallway and breathed and did not move. She was good at not moving. She was good at keeping her face arranged into something that gave away nothing. She had been practicing since she was a child. What she did not do in that hallway with the sound of her brother's celebration coming through the thin wall was panic. What she did instead was think. The letter was gone by morning. Brett had it somewhere, probably already drafted the reply in his head. But Clara had done something during the hour she spent in the dark after everyone went to sleep. She had remembered the name on the letter. Harlan Caldwell, Land and Property, Millfield, Texas. She had gone to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen where Brett kept the household paperwork, found a scrap of paper and the stub of a pencil and written it down. She folded the paper and put it in the lining of her boot. When Brett told her at breakfast the next morning that she was going west, she looked at the table and said nothing. When he told her to be ready in a week, she nodded and went about her day. She mended a fence post that afternoon in the cold wind alone and thought about what it meant that being sent somewhere as a joke felt on some fundamental level like relief. That was the saddest part. Not the cruelty of what they were doing. The sad part was that she had spent the rest of that afternoon feeling something she could only identify as the far edge of hope. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself she knew what waited at the end of that road. Humiliation, rejection, the return trip east with her brother's laughter waiting on the other side. She told herself all of it firmly the way you tell yourself things you know are true, but do not want to be. And then she packed her bag. She kept the paper in her boot, and she waited. And the morning she walked to the Dry Hollow stage stop, the streets were empty. The general store was shuttered. A dog barked somewhere and gave up. The coach was already waiting, battered and road-worn, pulled by two horses that looked like they had made their peace with the work a long time ago. There was one other passenger, a woman of about 50, well-dressed in the way of someone from a larger town, with a carpet bag on her lap and the alert, friendly energy of a person who did not like silence. Martha Cole introduced herself before the coach had cleared the edge of town. She was traveling to Redfield to visit her sister. She had made the trip before. She knew the road. "You have people in Millfield, dear?" she asked. Clara looked out the window at Dry Hollow sliding away behind them. The Ashford property passed on the south side. Dark windows. No smoke from the chimney. No one standing in the yard to watch her go. "No," Clara said. "Just going." Martha accepted this with the gracious incuriosity of a woman who had learned that some people carried their reasons close and it was not her business to pry. She pulled her knitting from the carpet bag and began working it with the easy competence of someone who could do it in the dark. They rode west and the town disappeared, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the plains open up ahead of her like something she did not yet have the right word for. Martha talked when she talked about her sister, about the weather, about the price of dry goods in Redfield compared to what they charged in the larger towns farther east. Clara listened and offered small responses when they were needed, and let the conversation wash over her without requiring much of her attention. It was on the second afternoon, somewhere between a dry creek crossing and a stand of scrub juniper, that Martha said something that caught Clara's full attention. "I have heard of Harrow Range," Martha said, apparently continuing a thought Clara had not caught the beginning of. "The man who runs it. Harlan Caldwell brokered a land deal for my sister's neighbor some years back, and he spoke well of him. Said he was one of the straightest dealers in the territory. A man who said what he meant and meant what he said." Clara looked at her. "Eli Harrow. That is the one." Martha glanced up from her knitting. "You know him?" "Not yet," Clara said. Martha seemed to find this a sufficient answer. She went back to her knitting. She got off at Redfield the following afternoon with a warm handshake and a smile that had already half moved on to the next chapter of her day. Clara was alone for the last stretch. The terrain changed as they moved west. The flat plains gave way to something rougher and more honest. The land folded and rolled, cut through with dry washes and red rock formations that rose without warning from the scrub like the bones of something enormous buried long ago. The cottonwoods disappeared. What replaced them was juniper and sage, everything stripped to its essentials by wind and drought and the mathematics of survival. Clara found herself liking it. There was something in it she recognized. No softness that had not been earned. No pretense about what it was. Millfield appeared on the third morning. She had expected something like Dry Hollow. She found something different. A town that had decided to take itself seriously. A proper main street with raised boardwalks. A two-story hotel. A bank with a painted sign. People moving with the purposeful energy of a place that had things to do and intended to do them. The coach pulled up in front of the hotel and Clara climbed down stiff and dusty and retrieved her bag from the driver. She stood on the boardwalk and looked both ways down the street and found what she was looking for halfway down the block. Harlan Caldwell, Land and Property. The sign was small and the paint was beginning to go at the edges, but the office behind it looked clean through the window. She walked toward it. Her boots were loud on the boards. She kept her chin level and her expression neutral, which she was very good at, and she did not look at the people who looked at her, though she noted each of them in her peripheral vision, the way she had learned to note everything. Caldwell's office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular dust of a small room that held more documents than it had been designed for. Maps on every wall, ledgers stacked in columns that followed some logic only their keeper understood. A desk behind which sat a man of about 60, with a broad, careful face and eyes that did not miss much. He looked up when she came in. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Not a question. You were expecting me. I had a letter from your brothers indicating your travel." He paused, seeming to select his next words with some care. I was not entirely certain what to expect from their communication. It was not what I would call a thorough introduction. Clara stood in the center of the room and looked at him directly. "I would appreciate knowing what the actual arrangement is before we go any further," she said. Her voice came out without a shake in it. It had been that way for years. She had worked to make it that way. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. Then he folded his hands on the desk and made the decision to be direct. "Mr. Harrow is a serious man," he said. "He runs a substantial cattle operation northeast of town. He lost his wife some years back, and the ranch has been difficult to manage alone. He is not looking for a decorative arrangement. He asked specifically for someone capable, practical, and willing to do real work." "All right." He also, Caldwell paused here, was in a fire some years ago. He carries significant scarring on the left side of his face and neck. Some people find it alarming on first meeting. Clara thought about all the ways she had been looked at in her life. The pity, the dismissal, the careful, practiced indifference that was somehow worse than either. She thought about what it must be like to have people look at you and see the damage before they saw anything else. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "When can I meet him?" Something moved in Caldwell's expression. Not quite surprised, but adjacent to it. He had expected a different response. She could tell by the slight recalibration in his posture, the way a man adjusts when the room does not behave as predicted. "He comes to town on Fridays for supplies," Caldwell said. "That is tomorrow. Then I will wait until tomorrow." She had one more question before she stood to leave. "The letter from my brothers," she said. "What did it say about me?" Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Then it was brief. "And it was not respectful in its characterization of you." Clara held very still. "I want you to know," Caldwell said carefully, "that Mr. Harrow read it, set it aside, and asked me to invite you anyway." He paused. "He told me that a man's opinion of a woman tells you considerably more about the man than it does about her." Clara stood with that for a long moment. The office was quiet around her. Outside, Millfield went about its business in the ordinary sounds of a town in the middle of its day. "Thank you," she said. She meant it plainly, without decoration. She went to find the hotel. The room was small and clean and cost more than she had. She paid for it with coins she had been setting aside for years in the small economies available to a woman in her position. Coins saved from errands, from the occasional sale of kitchen garden produce, from the invisible commerce of a person who has learned to want less, so there is always something left over. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the lamplight and looked at the wall and tried not to think ahead. The range of outcomes was wide. She knew the shape of what her brothers intended. She had known it since that night in the hallway. She would go to the meeting tomorrow, and the man would look at her and see what her brothers had sent, which was a problem, and address the discarded sister of a failed farm. He would send her back east, or he would not. And if he did not, that would mean something she was not yet ready to put words to. She lay down on top of the blanket without undressing, which was a habit from years of shared walls and brothers who did not believe in locks. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did not dream about Dry Hollow. Eli Harrow arrived in Millfield the next morning on a horse that was clearly the finest animal for 100 miles in any direction. Clara saw him from the window of the hotel dining room, where she had been sitting with a cup of coffee she was making last as long as she could. She recognized him by process of elimination. A large man riding alone, unhurried, moving down the main street with the directness of someone who knew exactly where he was going and felt no need to perform anything about it. The left side of his face was different even from across the street. The skin there caught the morning light differently. Tighter, she thought. Smoother in the wrong way. He rode past her line of sight toward Caldwell's office. She set down the coffee cup, checked her teeth from old habit automatic left over from years of making herself presentable in a house where no one cared whether she was or not, picked up her bag, walked out into the morning. Caldwell's office was considerably smaller with 3 people in it. Eli Harrow was standing when she came in. He had risen when he heard the door, and the small gesture landed on Clara with a weight she had not anticipated. She could not remember the last time a man had stood up when she entered a room. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. His work clothes were clean, but had clearly been cleaned in a hurry, which told her something about the kind of man he was that he had thought to try. His hat was in his hands. The scarring on the left side of his face was substantial. It ran from above his temple down across his jaw and disappeared below his collar. The skin was pale and pulled and textured in the way of old burns, and it had changed the shape of the left corner of his mouth in a way that might have read as contempt on a different face in a different light. She looked at him directly. She did not glance away and back. She did not do the thing people did where they looked just past the damaged part as though the act of not staring was itself a kindness. She looked at him the way she would look at anyone she was trying to understand, and she watched him notice that. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was low and careful. "Mr. Harrow." She set her bag down and extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm without making a statement about it. Caldwell appeared at the back door. "I will give you two some time," he said, and disappeared through it with the practiced tact of a man who had arranged many such meetings. Eli indicated the chairs in front of the desk. She sat. He sat across from her, hat on his knee, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was not the uncomfortable silence of two strangers with nothing to offer each other. It had the quality of two people actually thinking, which was rarer than it should have been. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said finally. "I would prefer that." The letter Caldwell sent out described a practical arrangement. "That is accurate. The ranch has work that is beyond what I can manage alone, and I have had difficulty keeping reliable help." He stopped, seemed to be working through something. "I am not offering something easy. The winters here are worse than people expect. The work is real work." "I know what real work is," Clara said. He looked at her, not the way people in Dry Hollow had looked at her, not with the cataloging of deficiencies she had come to think of as her natural climate. He was actually looking at her the way you look at something you find genuinely interesting and want to understand. "Your brother's letter," he said carefully. "It was not what I would call a comprehensive introduction. What did it say?" Something shifted in his expression. Brief, not quite discomfort, but close to it. "It was not respectful in how it characterized you," he said. "I want you to know that I read it, set it aside, and asked Caldwell to reach out to you anyway." He paused. "Because I have found that a man's opinion of a woman tells you considerably more about the man than it does about her." Clara looked at him steadily. "That is a fair position," she said. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not what your brothers would say. What you would say." No one had ever asked her that before. Not like that. Not with that quality of actually wanting to know. She took a breath. She thought about it honestly, not the reflexive self-diminishment she had learned to lead with, not the careful minimizing that had become second nature over 24 years. "I am practical," she said. "I do not panic when things go wrong because things have been going wrong most of my life and panicking never helped. I know livestock, both cattle and horses. I can cook and I can mend, and I can read a ledger, which I suspect is useful here. I do not need to be entertained, and I am not afraid of silence." She paused. "I should also tell you that I am aware this arrangement started as a joke at my expense. My brothers thought it would be amusing to send me somewhere I would be rejected. I am telling you that because you should know who you are dealing with on my side of this, and because I would rather you hear it from me than figure it out later and feel I had concealed it." Eli was very still for a moment. "Then how long has that been going on?" he asked it quietly. Not with pity, just asking. "Most of my life," she said. "And you still came." She met his eyes. They were brown, very steady, brown and steady, and actually looking at her. "I still came," she said. He drove her out to Harrow Range that afternoon in a wagon, taking the northeast road out of Millfield through country that grew more dramatic the further they moved from town. Red rock formations building on the southern horizon, land rolling into shallow valleys thick with sage. The sky enormous and pale and so open it made the inside of the Ashford house feel like something she had spent her whole life in without knowing the door was unlocked. They talk carefully the way people talk when they are trying to understand something without revealing that is what they are doing. He told her about the ranch, the herd's 60 head of mixed cattle on open range, the water situation heading into winter, his 3 hands and their respective qualities. "Cal Greer has been with me 4 years," he said. "Knows cattle better than most men I have known. Silas Pruitt is newer but quick and willing. Decker Ames does the work, but he has a drinking problem I keep hoping will resolve itself and has not." She appreciated that he did not dress it up. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Clara caught her breath before she could stop herself. She had been imagining something like the Ashford property, a house that had never quite been enough land managed out of necessity and nothing more. What she saw instead was a place that had been built with intention, a main house of timber and stone solid, and squarely set with a long porch running the front length and a chimney at each end, a large barn behind it in evident good repair. Corrals to the east with fence lines that ran straight and true, a windmill turning slowly against the sky. There was a wing off the east side of the house that had been started and stopped, the framing exposed, waiting for something she did not yet understand. "It is larger than I expected," Clara said. He glanced at her. "Is that good or bad?" She looked at the straight fence lines, the tended barn, the solid stone foundation of the house. She thought about the Ashford farmhouse, its broken window and its rotting porch step, and the particular smell of a place that had given up on itself. "Good," she said, and she meant it simply, without loading it with anything it did not need to carry. He pulled the wagon up at the barn and came around to her side and extended a hand to help her down. She took it briefly, finding her footing on the ground. The gesture cost him nothing. It cost her something to receive it, though she kept that private. The room he showed her was at the east end of the upper hall. It had a window that faced the direction the sun came from. The morning light would lie across the floor in long, clean bars. And on the door a lock, a real one with a brass key on a hook beside the frame. Clara stood in the center of the room for a moment. She looked at the window. She looked at the lock. She breathed through something careful and complicated and did not let it show in her face, but it was there, moving through her like water, finding the low places in dry ground. A room with a lock on the door. She turned around. Eli was in the doorway, watching her with something patient in his expression. "I will take you to see the horses," he said. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses in the particular dusty piece of a well-kept animal space. 3 working horses turned their heads at her arrival with the calm curiosity of animals accustomed to strangers. The 4th did not. She stood at the far end of the barn apart from the others, a dark red roan with a well-built frame and a scar along her left flank that was old and healed but had once been serious. She did not look at Clara with aggression. She looked at her with a weariness that was different from aggression and considerably worse. The specific weariness of a creature that had been hurt badly enough that it had stopped expecting the world to be otherwise. "What happened to her?" Clara asked. "Previous owner." Eli's voice went flat in a way that said everything necessary about what that phrase contained. "I bought her at auction 2 years ago. She has been difficult since." He paused. "I keep her." He seemed briefly uncertain about how to finish that sentence. She understood the uncertainty. Some things did not need finishing. "I will give her some time," Clara said. She said it without thinking, and then registered that she had said it as though the arrangement was already settled, as though she already lived here. She looked at Eli. "Is it settled?" she said. "I do not want to assume." He was quiet for a moment. The barn was warm around them, and outside she could hear the windmill, and somewhere across the yard, Cal Greer's voice, low and unhurried. "I think it is," Eli said. "If you want it to be." She thought about the road behind her. 3 days across open country in a broken coach. The empty Ashford house with its dark windows and its smell of old smoke, and 2 brothers who had drunk themselves to sleep, celebrating her absence. She thought about the room at the end of the hall, the window facing east, the lock on the door. "I want it to be," she said. He nodded. It was not an elaborate moment. It did not need to be. 2 people making a real agreement in a barn with a damaged horse watching from the back corner. He drove her back to Millfield to collect her things. Her things fit in the same bag she had carried from Dry Hollow. It did not take long. At the barn door, Eli stopped and turned back. She could see him working towards something that did not come easily. "For what it is worth," he said. "What your brothers did, sending you out here the way they did." He stopped. "You deserve better than that." She stood very still. Nobody had ever said that to her before. Not those words in that order, with that particular undecorated certainty. Not as a performance of sympathy, not as something designed to generate obligation. Just a statement of what he plainly believed to be true. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He nodded once and walked out into the afternoon sun. Clara stood alone in the warm and dusty quiet. The windmill turned outside. The light came in through the open barn doors and lay across the hay-scattered floor in long bars of gold. She picked up her bag. She followed him out. That night, alone in the hotel room in her last hours before everything changed, Clara lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and tried out of old habit to find the catch, the thing she had missed, the angle she had not accounted for. She turned it over and over in the lamplight. She could not find one. A man who had read a dismissive letter from her brothers and invited her anyway, who had shaken her hand and listened to her speak and asked her what she would say about herself, who had shown her a room with a lock on the door as though that were simply an obvious thing that obviously mattered because it did, who had said you deserve better in a barn without asking anything in return for saying it. She was not naive. She understood this was the beginning of something, not the thing itself, that the real shape of it would emerge over weeks and months of actual daily life, that she could still be wrong about him. But she also understood that she had ridden 3 days west in a broken coach on the wrong side of her brother's cruelty, and at the end of it she had found a man who looked at her and saw a person. Not a problem, not a burden, not the discarded sister of a failed farm. A person. The lamp guttered in a small draft. Outside, a horse moved on the street below. The frontier night was enormous and cold and full of stars. She was still afraid. Fear did not dissolve because you had spent one good afternoon with someone. She knew that. But underneath the fear, underneath all the careful walls and the practiced stillness and the long-trained habit of wanting as little as possible, something was doing what it had been trying to do since she had pressed her ear against that thin wall in Dry Hollow 3 weeks ago. It was hoping. And this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let it. Part 2, taking root. She moved into Harrow Range on a Tuesday. Significant things were supposed to happen on days that felt like they mattered. Stormy mornings, dramatic light, some quality in the air that told you the world was paying attention. Tuesday was just Tuesday. Gray sky and the smell of coming rain, and Cal Greer loading her single canvas bag off the wagon without comment, and Silas Pruitt pretending not to watch from the corral fence with the unconvincing casualness of a young man who was absolutely watching. Eli had cleared a path to the front door, which Clara understood only later had meant moving 3 months of accumulated mail, 2 broken lanterns, and a saddle that had no business being in an entryway. He did not explain any of that. She simply noticed the clean floor and the faint drag marks in the dust that told her it had recently been otherwise. He did not make anything of it. Neither did she. This was where she lived now. The thought was strange enough that she had to sit with it for a moment before she could move. She went upstairs, set her bag on the floor of the east room, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settle around her. The horses, the windmill, a metallic clang from the barn that she would learn in time was Silas Pruitt and his ongoing inability to maintain his grip on a bucket. She unpacked what little she had, hung her second dress on the hook behind the door, set her mother's water tin on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, went downstairs to find the kitchen. The kitchen told her everything she needed to know about the last 8 years. The stove worked, which was the important thing, but the shelves had the organization of a man who cooked out of necessity rather than method. Flour next to axle grease, coffee beside a bottle of wound salve, nothing where logic would put it. The window above the wash basin had a crack in the lower left corner patched with what appeared to be dried mud. The table had 4 chairs, one of them with a leg slightly shorter than the others. Clara stood in the center of it with her hands on her hips and looked around slowly, the way you look at a problem you intend to solve. Eli appeared in the doorway. He seemed briefly self-conscious, which surprised her. He did not strike her as a man who spent much time in that particular condition. "It is not much," he said. "It is a kitchen," Clara said. "I can work with it." She found out that first morning that Eli Harrow was a man of strict routine. Up before the sun without exception. Coffee going before the sky had committed to anything. Out to the barn within 20 minutes of the light changing. He ate breakfast after the morning work was started, not before, which was different from anything she had known. He ate quickly and without ceremony, though he thanked her when she set food in front of him. That was also different from anything she had known. The first meal she made for the household was consumed by Cal Greer in complete silence, by Silas Pruitt, with a brief nod of genuine approval, by Decker Ames, not at all, because he was sleeping something off in the bunkhouse, and by Eli in approximately 4 minutes before he stood, said thank you, Ashford, and went back outside. She cleaned up alone and tried to figure out what her days were supposed to look like. Nobody had given her instructions. She suspected Eli had been alone long enough that he had forgotten how to explain the obvious. She would have to learn by looking. So she looked. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen into something that followed logic, identified which supplies were running low, repaired the cracked window with proper materials she found in the shed, and fixed the short-legged chair with a scrap of wood and 20 minutes of attention. Eli came in the third evening and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the shelves. "You move things," he said. Not an accusation, just noticing. "The coffee was next to wound salve," Clara said without turning from the stove. A pause. "That has been bothering me." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his hat in his hand, looking at the reorganized shelves with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The one where something had relieved a small, persistent tension he had stopped noticing was there. "I should have asked first," Clara said. "It is your kitchen." He looked at her directly. "It is your kitchen too," he said. Then he seemed mildly surprised by his own directness and moved past the doorway before either of them had to sit with the weight of what he had said. She stood at the stove and let it be what it was. Her kitchen too. The hardest thing about the first weeks was not the work. Work she could do. Work was familiar and grounding and gave each day a shape she could hold on to. The hardest thing was learning to exist in a space with a man who was genuinely not unkind. She kept waiting for it. The thing beneath the surface. The trap door in the floor of reasonable behavior that you eventually fell through. With Brett and Dean, the pattern had always been consistent. A period of tolerable coexistence, sometimes days, sometimes longer. Then something would shift. Bad weather, money trouble, a frustration neither of them could name. And the cruelty would surface with the specific precision of people who knew your weak points and had been cataloging them for years. She had learned to read the pressure changes, the way Brett's shoulders set differently 2 days before something broke, the way Dean's humor sharpened into something that cut before it drew back. She kept waiting for that with Eli. It did not come. That made her more uneasy, not less. She had been shaped by a particular kind of weather for so long that the absence of it felt like a false calm. She caught herself bracing for things that did not happen. She would make a mistake, a tally in the accounts, she had to redo a batch of biscuits that came out wrong, and she would set her jaw and wait. And Eli would notice the mistake without drama, and they would correct it, and that would be the entirety of it. Once, about 2 weeks in, she dropped an entire pot of soup. A full pot heating for the noon meal caught wrong coming off the stove, and it went down in a crash that sent broth across 3 walls, and the floor, and her dress, and her boots. She stood in the aftermath with her heart hammering, automatically calculating the damage, and she braced hard. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway about 30 seconds later. He looked at the soup on the walls, the soup on the floor, the soup on Clara. "You hurt?" he asked. "No." Her voice had gone flat in the way it did when she was managing something internal. "Good." He went to the corner where the mop was kept and brought it back and started on the floor. She stood there for a moment, genuinely uncertain what was happening. "You do not have to," she started. "I know," he said. "Hand me that rag." She handed him the rag. They cleaned up the soup together without speaking. Then she started over with what was left in the pantry, and he went back outside. And that was the whole of it. No commentary, no inventory of her carelessness. No debt recorded somewhere to be collected later. Just a man with a mop doing what needed doing. She thought about that for a long time afterward. In the second week, she found the ledger. It was on the small desk in the corner of the front room, half buried under a stack of correspondence, and a broken bridle waiting months for someone to attend to it. She lifted it out and opened it carefully. What she found inside was not chaos exactly. It was the record of a capable man doing his best with something that was not his strength. The entries were honest, but inconsistent. Months of careful notation followed by gaps where the accounting had simply stopped. Columns that did not reconcile. Supply costs that were higher than they needed to be. And at the back of the ledger, in a separate section written in a different hand, something that stopped her completely. The handwriting was a woman's, precise and unhurried, with the clarity of someone who had been taught that numbers needed to be unambiguous. The entries were older, the dates from before the gap that had swallowed the last 8 years. But the method in them was sound, and reading them was like finding a door in a wall you had assumed was solid. She set the ledger down. Then she went to the small desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, folded carefully and placed flat, was a sheaf of papers. She lifted the top one. It was a drawing, detailed and deliberate, made by someone who could see the finished thing clearly in their mind and was transferring what they already knew onto the page. It was a design for the east wing of the house. She realized, the one she had seen unfinished from the wagon on her first day. There were notations in the same precise handwriting. Measurements, material notes, a small addendum in the margin about the placement of a window to catch the afternoon light. Clara looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she heard Eli's boots on the porch. She put the drawing back exactly as she had found it and closed the drawer, and was at the kitchen stove when he came through the door. She waited until the evening meal was done and Silas had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Cal had taken his coffee outside the way he preferred. Then she said without preamble, "I found the ledger and the drawings in the desk." Eli was at the wash basin. His hands went still. She kept her voice even. "The handwriting in the back of the ledger is different from yours. So is the hand on the drawings." He dried his hands, took a long time doing it, turned around and crossed to the table and sat down. He looked at the surface of it in the way of a man deciding how much of a thing to say. "Nora," he said finally. "My wife." Clara waited. "She did not die of fever alone," he said. "That is what I have told people, and it is not inaccurate, but it is not complete. There was a fire, 8 years ago this spring, in the barn. It spread faster than it should have." He was quiet. "I got her out." He said it without heroism, as a plain fact among other plain facts. "I got her out, but she was badly burned and she did not recover." He touched the left side of his face, then without seeming to realize he was doing it. "I was in there longer," he said. Clara did not say she was sorry. She had learned that sorry was often what people offered when they did not know what else to give, and Eli was not a man who needed that particular currency. "The East Wing was her plan," Clara said instead. "Yes." He looked at the table. She had it drawn out completely. Everything thought through. He paused. "I have not touched it since." Clara looked at the closed desk drawer across the room, thought about the precise handwriting, the window placement noted for the afternoon light. "I understand," she said. He nodded once. They did not speak of it again that night, but something had shifted in the room, quiet and significant, the way a heavy piece of furniture shifts when you finally find the right angle to move it. The accounts occupied her mornings for the better part of the following week. She worked through them methodically, starting at the back with Nora's entries and moving forward through the years of Eli's keeping, reconstructing the logic where it had frayed and identifying where it had broken down. The supply costs were the clearest problem. Harlan Caldwell's preferred supplier in Millfield was charging approximately 15% more than the comparable merchant in Redfield for the same goods. Over a year, the difference was not trivial. She asked Silas Pruitt to bring her both merchants' recent price lists when he made his next town run. He came back with them without asking why, which she noted with quiet appreciation. She built the comparison in the ledger's margin with clean figures and a notation at the bottom about the annual difference. She put it in front of Eli at breakfast on Thursday. He read it twice, looked at her, read it again. "You did this in a week," he said. "I had the time." He turned the ledger in his hand slowly. "The supply order goes out Friday. Caldwell will not be pleased about losing the business. Caldwell is an agent, not a friend." He said it simply, without apology. He looked at the figures again. "Can you put the comparison in writing? Something formal to show him?" "I already have," Clara said. She set the second sheet on the table beside the ledger. He looked at it. Something moved through his expression that lived in the vicinity of a smile without quite being one. It was Cal Greer who first said anything about the cattle. He found her at the East Corral fence on a Thursday afternoon in the third week, her small ledger open on the rail, making notes on the herd by individual animal, the way she had once tracked the few cattle her father had kept before he died. She had been at it for several days, learning the herd by observation and pattern, and the small deviations that indicated something had changed. Cal leaned on the fence beside her and looked out at the cattle for a long time before saying anything. That was his way. He was a man of few words, and all of them considered. "Number 23 has been off her feed," he said eventually. He indicated an older cow standing slightly apart from the herd. "How long?" Clara asked. 2 days, maybe 3. I will look at her tomorrow morning if she is the same." Cal glanced at her sideways. He had 40 years in those eyes, 40 years of reading animals and land and men from a distance, and making accurate assessments of all three. You know cattle, he said. Some, Clara said. He nodded slowly. More than some, he said. And that was the end of it. But she understood she had passed something without it being announced as a test. That was the best kind of passing. Then, she began going to the barn in the evenings, not to approach Ember directly. That was not how it worked, and she knew it from the start. She went to the barn and did other things, checked the tack, swept the aisle, spent time with the working horses, letting the space become familiar and unremarkable before she asked anything of it. Ember watched her from the back of her stall. The dark eyes tracked every movement, every sound. Not hostile, just ready. The readiness of a creature that had learned the world operated on a hair trigger and had adjusted everything about itself accordingly. On the fifth evening, Clara brought the account ledger to the barn and sat down on a hay bale approximately 15 feet from Ember's stall and began reading aloud. The numbers were genuinely quite dry. Supply costs and cattle prices and the unhurried language of a ranch's financial life. She thought the dryness was probably useful. Nothing alarming in any of it. Just a voice in the space saying ordinary things, asking nothing. She heard Eli come in behind her and stop. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading to the horse," she said without looking up. A long pause. "Is that something you have done before?" "No." "I am working it out as I go." Another pause. "Is it working?" She glanced at Ember. The mare's ears were forward. Her head was a fraction lower than it had been in previous evenings. The quality of her tension had shifted from braced to something else. Not relaxed, not by any measure, but different. "A little," Clara said. She heard Eli settle against the wall behind her. Not leaving, not crowding either. Just staying in the space without requiring anything of it. She went back to the ledger. The numbers were just as dry as before. She read them aloud in the same unhurried voice. The windmill turned outside. Ember's ears stayed forward. They remained like that for the better part of an hour. Clara reading. Eli listening without comment. Ember standing in her corner with something in her posture that was almost not quite, but almost the beginning of ease. When Clara finally looked up, Ember had taken 2 steps toward the front of her stall without appearing to notice she had done it. "Good girl," Clara said quietly, to no one in particular. Behind her, she heard Eli shift against the wall in a way that sounded like he was smiling. She did not say anything about that. She did not need to. The storm came in the 4th week. She had been watching the sky build for 2 days. The particular color at the western horizon. The way the air felt close and heavy in a manner that did not belong to this country's usual dryness. Cal had pulled the herd into the closer pasture without being asked. The horses were restless. Even Ember, who had by then progressed to taking grain from Clara's hand at the front of her stall, paced in the evening with a sustained tension in her body that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with what was gathering outside. It broke on a Thursday night. The rain came first hard and sideways, hitting the windows like thrown gravel. Then the wind built until the house was vibrating at its joints, and from the direction of the barn, she heard the first significant crash of something structural giving way. She was already mostly dressed when she heard it. She had not been sleeping. She had been lying in the dark, listening to the weather gather itself, and she had known. She came downstairs and found Eli already at the front door in his coat and boots, lantern in hand. He looked at her. "You do not need to come out," he said. She was already pulling her coat off the hook. "What was that sound, the lean-to on the east side of the barn?" "I need to check the horses." He paused. "Clara." "I am coming," she said, not as an argument, as a fact. He held her gaze for a half-second. Then he opened the door and they went out together into the storm. The wind hit them like something with intentions. She ducked her head and followed the swing of the lantern across the yard, the ground already thick with water mud pulling at her boots with every step. The barn door was fighting its hinges. They got it open together, her weight pulling while Eli worked the latch, and they fell through into the relative shelter of the interior. The working horses were frightened, all three moving in their stalls, the whites of their eyes catching the lantern light. Ember was worse. Pressed into the far corner of her stall, trembling with a whole-body tension that occupied the space where sound should have been. "She will hurt herself," Clara said. "I know." Eli moved toward Ember's stall and the mare's head came up sharply, ears flat. "Let me," Clara said. He stopped. The lantern threw the scarring on his left side into sharper relief, And Clara registered this the way she registered all of it, as part of the whole, not as something requiring a separate response. "All right," he said. She went to Ember's stall door, unlatched it slowly, stepped inside without reaching her hand at her side not extended toward the horse. The mare was shaking hard. Outside, the storm drove at the barn walls with the sound of something that wanted in. Clara did not look at Ember directly. She looked at the wall behind the horse's ear, at the hay on the floor, at nothing in particular. And she talked. Low and continuous, not quite words, just the sound of her voice in the dark, steady and without demand. The same voice she used when she read the ledger aloud in the evenings. Nothing alarming in any of it. It took a long time. Incrementally, by degrees so small they were nearly imperceptible. The shaking in Ember's body began to ease. The ears moved forward, the head lowered fractionally. Clara let herself breathe more visibly, a slow breath in and a slow breath out, and felt the mare's attention follow the rhythm of it. When she was finally close enough to put her hand on Ember's neck, the horse flinched once, and then did not flinch again, and then leaned just slightly into the contact. Clara stood in the storm-battered dark with her hand on the trembling horse and felt something in her own chest ease that she had not known was clenched. She looked up. Eli was at the stall door. He had been there the entire time. He was watching her with an expression she did not have a ready word for. Not quite wonder. Something quieter than wonder. The kind of attention that is rare enough you feel it as a physical presence. She just needed someone to stay, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. The storm still hammered outside, but inside the barn the horses had settled, and the lantern made its small warm circle in the dark. "Yeah," he said. "I know something about that." She did not look at him when he said it. He did not seem to need her to. It was just the truth said plainly in a barn in a storm, and it remained in the air between them the way true things do, not asking for anything. Just there. They checked the rest of the barn together, secured the damaged lean-to panel as best they could against a wind that contested every nail, and made their way back to the house through rain that had committed itself completely. They were soaked through by the time they got inside. Clara shook water from her braid and looked at the puddle forming around her boots on the front hall floor. "There is coffee still on," she said. "I know," he said. They sat at the kitchen table in their wet clothes and drank coffee while the storm finished making its point outside. She was aware of the particular strangeness of sitting with someone after something difficult and having the difficulty not become a debt. Eli was not cataloging what had happened. He was not building a case. He was just drinking coffee. "The south fence is going to need work," she said, because practical ground was easier to stand on just then. "Yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "The supply order." "Already adjusted," she said. "I accounted for fence materials when I revised the order on Thursday." He looked at her across the table. She had built the adjustment into the Redfield comparison figures 2 days ago before the storm because she had been watching the sky and doing the arithmetic of what was coming. He set down his cup. Something in his face had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was not the quiet of a man holding something back. It was the quiet of a man who had just understood something he had not expected to understand. "Clara," he said. Her name this time, not Ashford. She looked at him. "This place," he said. He stopped, seemed to be working towards something that required precision. "It is running better than it has in years, all of it." She held that. "I want you to know," he said, "that I see what you are doing here. The accounts, the kitchen, Ember, the way you have been learning the herd." He paused. "I see it." She had spent most of her life doing exactly this work. The looking ahead, the quiet competence that kept things from falling apart, and having it go entirely unseen, not even unappreciated. Unseen. As though she were a mechanism in the household rather than a person making choices and expending thought and effort and care. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in a way that was difficult to account for without explaining the entirety of her history. So she did not explain. She let it land. He nodded once. They went back to their coffee. The storm wore itself out by 2 in the morning. By the time she finally went upstairs, the night had gone completely quiet in the particular way that follows something violent. Complete and fragile and very still. She paused at the top of the stairs and thought about what he had said in the barn. "I know something about that." A man who had carried the weight of a fire for 8 years. Who had kept a ranch running alone and not entirely well. Who had read a dismissive letter from her brothers and decided that what a man said about a woman told you more about the man than about her. He knew something about needing someone to stay. She went into her room. She locked the door. She stood looking at the locked door for a moment in the dark. Then she noted quietly and without ceremony that locking it now felt like a choice rather than a necessity. That was something. That was in fact quite a lot. Decker Ames had been coming in late from town with increasing regularity for 3 weeks, and Cal had mentioned it twice with the careful understatement of a man who believed in giving people the chance to correct themselves before the correction became unavoidable. It became unavoidable on a Wednesday. Eli let Decker go that afternoon. Quietly in the bunkhouse with 2 weeks' wages and a straight conversation about what would need to change if Decker ever wanted work again. Clara was not present and did not ask for details. She knew the shape of it from the sound of the exchange, the short voices, the long silence after. That evening, Eli came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked tired in a way that went past what the body accumulated in a working day. Clara put coffee in front of him without being asked and sat down across from him and waited. "I hate that part of it," he said. "I know. He has people somewhere who will wonder where he went." "You cannot be responsible for that," Clara said. "You gave him time and you gave him wages and you told him the truth. That is more than most would do." He turned the cup in his hands. "Does not make it easier." "No," she said. "It does not." He looked at her across the table. Not the way he had looked at her in Caldwell's office 3 months ago working out what she was. Something different now. Something more settled. This was the first time he had come to her, not because of a problem to solve or a decision to make, but simply because the end of a hard thing required another person to be in the room with. She understood that. She understood it before she could have put words to it. They sat in the kitchen until the lamp burned low. Eventually he said goodnight and went upstairs, and she sat for a moment longer in the warm kitchen with the sound of the windmill outside and the last of the coffee going cold in her cup. She was still here. That was the fact of it. She was still in spite of everything here. Part 3, what she built. She started to relax 6 weeks in. Not all the way. She was not built for all the way. Too many years in the Ashford house had installed too many tripwires for that. But enough. Enough that she stopped scanning every room for the thing that was going to go wrong. Enough that she started expressing opinions about the ranch's future without calculating the reception first. Enough that she sometimes sat on the front porch in the evening when the work was done and simply looked at the land. Eli had found her there one evening 2 weeks after the storm, and instead of going back inside, he had leaned against the porch post and looked out at the same stretch of range. They had stayed like that without talking long enough that the silence stopped being something to manage and became something else entirely. Comfortable maybe, or the thing adjacent to comfortable that she did not yet have a word for. She was in that state, the dangerous state of beginning to believe a thing was real when she heard the horses. Wednesday morning, early enough that the dew was still on the grass. She was at the kitchen table with the week's supply list open beside her ledger when she heard multiple riders coming up the ranch road at a speed that was not casual. She went to the front window. Brett and Dean Ashford rode into the yard like they owned it, which was a thing Brett did in most places, and Dean had learned by watching. They were on horses she did not recognize, better animals than anything the Ashford farm had kept when she left, which told her something about how they had spent the travel reimbursement that had been meant for her. Brett was in front, shoulders set in the way that meant he had decided in advance how this was going to go. Dean slightly behind, eyes already moving across the yard, the barn, the corrals, doing the arithmetic of the place. Her stomach dropped in the specific way it dropped when she saw them. A physical response so ingrained she could not prevent it. Somewhere in her chest, something that had been slowly unclenching tightened back into a fist. She was at the front door before she had decided to move. They saw her when she stepped onto the porch. Brett pulled his horse up and looked at her. Really looked. The way you look at something that surprises you by still existing in the form you expected to find, changed or broken. She could see the moment he registered that she was standing differently than she used to, that the house behind her was solid and the yard was maintained, and the whole situation was not the ruin he had come prepared to find. His expression adjusted, not to something better, to something more deliberate. "Clara," he said. No greeting in it, just her name as an announcement. "Brett." She kept her voice without a shake in it. "Dean." Dean was already reading the yard with calculating eyes. The barn roof in repair, the straight fence lines, the windmill turning. He was doing the math, and the math was not producing the answer he had come for. "Thought we would come and see how you were getting on," Brett said. He swung down from his horse without being invited and tied it to the yard post like the post existed for his convenience. "Since you never wrote, you never asked me to write," Clara said. She stayed on the porch. She did not go down to meet them. Brett noticed. He noticed everything that could be read as a failure of deference. "Is the rancher home?" He was walking toward the porch now, casual hat pushed back in the way he affected when he wanted to seem at ease while he was doing something else entirely. "He is out on the range." "Convenient." Brett stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. The angle was new. She was above him. They both understood that without acknowledging it. "We have come to take you home, Clara." "No." He blinked, fast, and he covered it. But she had grown up reading his face and she caught it. He had not expected that as the first word out of her mouth. He had expected qualification, apology, the careful hedging she had always used to manage his reactions. "No," she said again. Dean had come up beside Brett, now leaning against the porch rail with his arms crossed in the posture of someone watching a performance he had not yet decided how to feel about. Brett's voice shifted, not to anger yet, to the register just before it. "You do not live here. You are not this man's wife. Whatever Caldwell put together, it is not something that obligates him to keep you. You belong back in Dry Hollow." "I do not belong in Dry Hollow," she said. "I never did. You made certain of that." Something flickered across his face. "What does that mean?" "It means I know what you did." She held his gaze without effort. "You sent me out here as a joke. You took the travel money and thought it was funny. You thought he would take one look at me and I would come crawling back. That is what you planned. That is why you are surprised to find me standing on a porch instead of walking a road somewhere." Brett went very still. "You have gotten a mouth on you." "I have always had opinions," Clara said. "You just never listened." Dean made a short sound, not quite a laugh. Something closer to involuntary acknowledgement, the sound a person makes when something lands that they had not seen coming. Brett shot him a look that ended it immediately. "You listen to me," Brett said, stepping up onto the first porch step. He was not touching her. He had learned, or she had taught him through years of refusing to flinch at the right moments, that physical intimidation had consequences he could not walk back. But he was close enough that she could smell the road on him. Days of hard riding. He had come a long way to deliver this. "This man took you in out of pity, or he lacks the sense God gave a fence post. Either way, you walking around this place pretending you belong here does not make it true. He will figure out what you are. And when he does, you will have nowhere to go." "Nothing I have ever done has been good enough for you," Clara said. Her voice was very calm. She could feel her heart moving fast behind it, and she kept that entirely out of her face. "Not when I was a child. Not after Father ran the farm into the ground. Not anything I cooked or mended or managed or fixed. I could have held your entire operation together with both hands, and you would have found a way to make it mean nothing." She paused. "But that is not what this is about." She said it without the question in it. "You are not here because you miss me. You are here because someone in Millfield sent word back that I was actually staying and it did not go the way you planned. And that troubles you. Because if I am doing fine somewhere, that is a different story than the one you have been telling about me." The silence stretched. Dean had gone very still. He was watching this with the attention of someone recalibrating, reassessing a situation that had stopped moving in the direction he expected. "You do not know what you are talking about," Brett said. "Quiet now. The most dangerous register. I know exactly what I'm talking about." He took another step up. She did not step back. She held her ground on the porch with her hands at her sides and looked at him with the flat, clear steadiness of someone who has decided they are finished flinching. "This man does not know you," Brett said, and his voice had dropped low and deliberate. "I do. I know everything you are and everything you are not. You think because some burned-up rancher with no other options took you in, that changes what you are. He will figure it out. And when he does, that will be between him and me." The voice came from behind her. She turned. Eli had ridden into the yard from the south and dismounted without either of them hearing him. He had come around the side of the house, leading his horse by the reins, and he stopped at the base of the porch steps with a quietness that was more unsettling than noise would have been. He looked at Brett with the level, unhurried steadiness of a man who had nothing left to prove and knew it. Brett looked at him. Did the thing people did? Registered the scarring. Reassessed. Brett Ashford was not a man who frightened easily, but he was accurate about physical situations, and what Eli Harrow presented was not a man who was going to be managed by someone else's certainty. You are the rancher, Brett said. Eli Harrow. He did not offer his hand. You have come a long way. Came to collect my sister. Clara is not property to collect. His voice was even, not aggressive, something more controlled than aggressive, which was considerably more effective. She is here because she chose to be here. That is the beginning and end of it. Brett shifted his weight. With respect, he said, and the phrase already carried contempt inside it like a stone in fruit. You do not know the full picture of. I know the full picture, Eli said. I know you sent her out here expecting her to be rejected and kept the travel money that was meant for her. I know what your letter said about her. He paused. I know what kind of man sends his sister somewhere as a joke. The yard went completely quiet. The windmill turned. A horse moved in the barn. Brett went red. It started at his collar and moved upward. The specific color of a man who has been named accurately in public and cannot find a response that does not make it worse. That is not, Brett started. I am not interested in what you want to call it, Eli said. Clara is here. She is staying. If you have concerns about her welfare, I understand. The tone made clear he did not understand it in the way Brett would want. But those concerns are not going to be addressed by taking her somewhere she does not want to go. Dean had not moved from his position at the porch rail. He was watching Eli now with a careful attention he usually reserved for things he was trying to learn from. Something in his expression had shifted from the smug ease he had arrived with. He looked at Clara, a long, assessing look that was different from his usual calculation. Something in it that was almost not quite but almost uncertain. Clara, Brett said. He turned back to her. He had shifted tactics. She could hear it clearly now, the move from authority to something that wanted to pass for appeal. You do not know this man. A few weeks and you think I have known you my entire life, Clara said. That is exactly the point. His jaw went tight. You told Dean when you decided to send me out here that you did not care whether I came back or not. She watched the words land. I know you said it. I heard you through the wall. You said you did not much care which. She kept going steady the way she had learned to finish things she had started because stopping halfway was always worse. So I am telling you now to your face. I am not coming back. Not because of Eli, because I am telling you myself. That is my decision made by me. Brett was breathing harder than a man who had just ridden up should be breathing. That is it then. His voice had gone flat. You want to stand on some stranger's porch and throw your family away? You threw me away first, Clara said. And you did not do it on a porch. You did it in a kitchen with a bottle of whiskey laughing. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something that has been true for a long time finally gets said out loud in front of witnesses. It changes the quality of the air. It settles into the ground like water after a long dry spell. Dean looked away, not dramatically, just at the ground beside his boot briefly, and then back up. She could not read precisely what was in that look, but it was not the smirk she had anticipated. Brett stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to his horse and mounted and sat in the saddle, looking down at her with an expression she had no name for. Not quite anger, not quite anything else. You will regret this, he said. I have regretted plenty in my life, Clara said. None of it was leaving. He turned the horse and rode out of the yard without looking back. Dean was slower. He untied his horse and mounted and sat for a moment longer than Brett had, looking at Clara with that same unreadable expression. Then he said it quietly, low enough that it was only for her. He was never right about you, he said, about what you were worth. She stared at him. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he touched the brim of his hat and rode after his brother, and the two of them were gone down the ranch road in a rising screen of dust. The yard went quiet. Clara stood on the porch and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and made them stop through the stubbornness of someone who had done this many times before. The shaking stopped. What was underneath it did not stop, but the shaking stopped. Eli came up the porch steps. He did not touch her, just came to stand beside her and look out at the road where the dust was settling. After a moment, you all right? Yes. Then because it was him, not entirely. That is fair. She breathed. The morning was sharp-edged and specific after everything that had just happened. The windmill's slow, reliable turn. The light fully committed to the day now. Dean's last thing she said. What about it? He said that his entire life, and then he says that at the very end. She shook her head slowly. I cannot tell if it was real. Eli was quiet for a moment. Maybe both, he said. People who hurt you can still occasionally tell the truth. It does not cancel out either thing. She thought about that. It was the kind of right that did not make things comfortable, which was the most useful kind of right. I heard what you said to Brett, she said. You did not have to do that. I said what was accurate. He kept his eyes on the road. That is not doing someone a favor. That is just stating facts. She looked at him sideways. The morning light was on the right side of his face, the unscarred side, and she could see the line of his jaw and the set of it. A man who was mildly uncomfortable with having done something that might be described as kind and preferred to call it factual. Either way, she said. He gave a small nod. They stood a moment longer. Then he said he needed to ride back out to the south fence. One section was worse than he had thought, and Cal would need a second pair of hands before afternoon. I will have something hot for when you come in, Clara said. He went down the steps, gathered his horse, and rode south. She watched him go. Then she went back inside. 3 days later, she heard a single rider coming up the ranch road in the middle of the morning. She looked out the kitchen window and knew immediately this was not Brett returning. Brett always had Dean with him. This rider moved differently, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who owned every moment of the distance between where he was and where he was going. Gerald Ashford rode alone. His face was older than she remembered, more lined at the jaw. But his eyes, when he pulled up at the yard post and dismounted and looked toward the house, were exactly as she had always known them. Gray and evaluating, and perpetually finding the number slightly short of sufficient. She was already on the porch when he crossed the yard toward her. Clara, he said. Father. He looked at the house, the barn, the corrals, the windmill, the general evidence of a functioning operation. She watched him process it with the same silent calculation Dean had done 3 days ago, and understood with sudden clarity that this was where Dean had learned it. Brett told me what happened, he said. You know then that I'm staying. He paused, selecting something from a range of available approaches. Brett handled it poorly, he said. He does not have the patience for situations that require delicacy. I thought it was better if I came myself. Better for whom, she said. The edge in it surprised even her. She watched him register it. The small adjustment behind his eyes. I want to talk with you, Clara. That is all. Then talk. He looked at the porch, at the distance between them. He was a man who arranged conversations on territory he selected, and she was declining to give him the ground. I would rather come inside, he said. This is not a matter for a doorstep. This doorstep is fine. He breathed through his nose. She could see him working through his options, the particular internal selection process she had watched her entire childhood without understanding it for what it was. Now she could see the machinery of it clearly. He was choosing an approach the way you choose a tool for a specific job. You have been here 7 weeks, he said finally. His voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man having a rational conversation. You came here under circumstances that were poorly managed on our part. I want to acknowledge that. But the fact remains that you entered into an arrangement with a man you did not know under false pretenses on our side. That creates an obligation. It creates an obligation for you, Clara said. Not for me. I did not misrepresent anything. He reached into his coat then and produced a folded document. He set it on the porch rail between them without ceremony. Your mother left a parcel of land, he said, recorded in her will under your name. He paused. Brett needs the title cleared to settle certain debts. It is a small matter. A signature. Clara looked at the document. She did not touch it. So that is what this is, she said. It is a family matter, he said. Nothing more. She looked at him steadily. You rode 3 days to ask me to sign away the one thing my mother left me, and you dressed it up as concern for my welfare. Gerald said nothing. No, she said. She pushed the document back across the rail toward him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. His jaw tightened. You do not understand what you are saying. I understand exactly what I'm saying. That is the difference from the last time you saw me. He went quiet. She could see him setting down one approach and reaching for another. She had watched him do this her entire life without knowing she was watching it. I am your father, he said. His voice had changed, softer now, something that in a different history might have been able to carry genuine feeling. Whatever happened between you and your brothers, whatever you think of how things were managed at home, I am your family. You are my daughter. I have a responsibility. Do not, Clara said. He stopped. Do not use that word like it was something real, she said. Because if it had been real, I would not be standing on a stranger's porch 7 weeks later, having built the first life I have ever had that was not about surviving the people I lived with. She was very calm. She could feel how calm she was, and it was its own kind of revelation that she could say these things in this voice. You had 24 years to be my father. What you were was someone who let Brett determine what I was worth, who benefited from my work, and who looked the other way when it was convenient. She held his gaze without difficulty. Every day I spent keeping that house running while you looked somewhere else. Every year. I am not going back to that, and I am not signing anything. The yard was completely still. Gerald Ashford's face moved through several expressions and settled on something she had never seen it settle on before. Something stripped of strategy, something that might have been close to shame if he were a man with ready access to that particular feeling. He recovered quickly. You are making a mistake, he said. His voice had gone cold and precise. This arrangement is her business. Eli came around the side of the house. She had not heard him approach. He had come quietly, and he stopped beside her on the porch, not in front of her. Beside her. Hat in hand, dust on his boots, the look of a man who had been working and had heard something that required him to stop. Gerald looked at him, did what people did with Eli's face, filed it, moved on with the controlled efficiency of a man who had decided the scarring was irrelevant information. Mr. Harrow, her father said. Mr. Ashford, no offered hand. I would like to speak with my daughter alone. I would prefer to be here, Eli said. This is my property and Clara's my concern. Anything you want to say to her, you can say in front of me. He looked at Clara. Unless you want me to go inside. Your call. She looked at her father. Gerald was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man who had just understood something about the terrain that changed his assessment entirely. He was looking at Eli and then at Clara, and she could see the calculation running the nature of the arrangement, the degree of alliance, what it meant that this man asked her what she wanted. Stay, she said to Eli. He nodded once and held his ground. Gerald descended from the softer approach the way a man steps back from something that is not working and reaches for what he came in holding. You are making a serious mistake, he said, his voice gone cold and precise. This man cannot keep reliable help. He lives isolated. She does not belong to you, Eli said. His voice was still even. What you say about me on your road back to Dry Hollow is your business. What you say about Clara on my property is mine. He paused. You rode out here to take her back to a household where she was not treated as though she mattered. I know that because I read your son's letter and I have watched what 7 weeks of a different life looks like on a person. You can call it a family matter. What it looks like from where I'm standing is a man who lost something useful and wants it back. She does not belong to anyone, Clara said. Both men looked at her. That is the point, she said. She looked at her father steadily. I am not property to be retrieved. I am a person who made a choice. The same as I told Brett, that choice is made, and it is mine. She nodded at the document still sitting on the porch rail. And that is not something I will be signing. Not today. Not after you go home and send someone else. Not ever. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. The man who had run the Ashford household for decades through sustained invisible pressure looked at his daughter on another man's porch and encountered something he had not prepared for. She was not afraid of him. She watched him look at her and look again the way you look at a document you realize you have been misreading for years. You have changed, he said. Not entirely an accusation. Not entirely not one. Yes, she said. He breathed through his nose, looked at Eli, looked back at Clara. For the first time in her memory, he was genuinely uncertain. Not strategically uncertain, actually uncertain about what was in front of him. If something goes wrong out here, he said, and his voice had lost some of its precision, something loosened in it she had never heard before. If this goes badly, you have nowhere to come back to. You understand that? I know that, she said. I have known it since I left. She held his gaze. That is how much I meant it when I said I was staying. He picked up the unsigned document from the rail and put it back in his coat. He turned, walked to his horse, and mounted without another word. He sat in the saddle and looked at the ranch. The house, the barn, the corrals, the whole working shape of a place being built rather than endured. She could not read his expression from this angle. She realized she was finished trying to read it. He rode out. She waited until he was past the first bend before she let her breath go completely. Then she sat down on the top porch step because her legs had decided they had earned a moment. Eli sat beside her. Not immediately. He stood until her father's dust had settled back to nothing. Then he sat on the same step close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Neither of them spoke for a while. "You did not tell me you were watching for him," Clara said finally. "I was not certain he would come. But you thought he might. Brett does not make those kinds of decisions on his own. Someone sent them both in the first place." He was quiet. Someone always does. She thought about that. She had been so focused on Brett as the instrument of everything that had happened that she had stopped thinking about where Brett got his certainties. She should have known. She had grown up in that house. "I heard what you said," she told him. "That she does not belong to anyone." He waited. "Did you mean that the way I heard it? How did you hear it? Like you actually believed it? Not as a point to make. Like it was simply true." "I do believe it," he said. Like it was the most straightforward thing in the world. She sat with that. It should have been easy to receive. It was not easy to receive. She was aware of the specific friction in her, the part that had been so thoroughly trained to discount itself, that even direct evidence to the contrary required time to absorb. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that I do not need you to defend me. I am grateful for it, but I need you to know I can do it myself." "I know you can," he said. "I was not defending you. I was stating facts. There is a difference." She looked at him. "You did not need me to say any of that," he said. "You were already handling it. I said it because it was true and I was there." He paused. "If that overstepped, tell me." "It did not overstep," she said quietly. He nodded, looked back at the road. That afternoon she went to the barn. She went because she needed somewhere to be with what had happened, and the barn had become that kind of place. She went in through the side door and stood for a moment in the warm, dusty quiet, letting her eyes adjust. Ember was at the front of her stall. Not because Clara had called her, not because there was grain being offered, just standing there watching the door as though she had heard something coming that she had decided to move toward rather than away from. Clara walked to the stall slowly and stopped at the rail. Ember stretched her nose forward and placed it against Clara's shoulder with a warmth that was new. Not tentative, not a question. Just contact offered plainly the way a creature offers something when it has finally decided the offering is safe. Clara stood with her hand on the horse's face and felt something unknot in her chest that she had been carrying since she heard those riders come up the ranch road that morning. "I know," she said quietly. To Ember, to the barn, to no one in particular, and everyone it concerned. The mare breathed against her shoulder, warm and steady. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of hammers against fence posts somewhere out on the South Range. Real work in a real place continuing to be done. She stayed until the light faded. She was still there when it did. That evening after supper, after Cal and Silas had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Clara washed the dishes and Eli stayed at the table with his coffee the way he had taken to doing. Not helping with the washing. She had not asked him to. Just staying in the kitchen while she finished the evening, as though the end of the day required a little more company before it properly closed. The water in the basin, the lamp making its argument against the dark outside. "Clara," he said. She turned around. He was looking at his coffee cup, his thumb moving along the rim of it, the gesture she had come to know as the one he made when he was working towards something that required precision. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "What I said to your father and your brothers today. I was not building a debt." He looked up. "I need you to understand that. I am not keeping a ledger of what I have done that you owe me for. That is not how this works. Not here." She looked at him across the kitchen. "I know you were not," she said. "I just did not want you to feel Eli." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I have known since the first day what kind of man you are. That is why I trust you." He went very still for a moment. The lamp made its small, warm circle. Outside, the frontier night was doing what it always did, expanding in every direction without asking permission. She turned back to the dishes. She heard his chair shift. Not leaving, just settling. Ember took grain from Silas this morning, he said after a moment. She stopped, turned. He was looking at his cup, but the corner of his mouth, the scarred side, had shifted into something. She did, Clara said. First time she has taken anything from anyone but you. Clara felt something move through her that was warm and specific and impossible to contain entirely. She is getting there, Clara said. Yeah. A pause. She is. Clara dried the last bowl and hung the cloth on its hook. She stood at the wash basin for a moment with her hands braced on the edge of it, looking out the dark window at nothing. There was something she had been carrying for weeks now. Something she had been examining from a careful distance, turning over and looking at from every angle she could find, looking for the flaw in it, the hidden catch, the thing she had missed. She had not found one. She dried her hands. There is something I want to ask you, she said, still facing the window. All right, she turned around. The east wing, she said. Nora's plans for it. She watched him. He did not flinch. He had been getting better at not flinching, and she had been trying to notice that. You said you have not touched it since the fire. That is right. I found the drawings again last week, she said. I was not looking for them. I want to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly. All right. Do you want to finish it? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then I have not known how to want that, not without it feeling like I was moving past something I had not earned the right to move past. Clara looked at him steadily. You pulled her out of that fire, she said. It was not enough. No, she said quietly. But you have carried it for 8 years, and it is still not enough, and it is not going to become enough no matter how much longer you carry it. She paused. That is not the same thing as forgetting her. He looked at the table, then back at her. Nora would have liked that you asked, he said. His voice had gone quiet and direct. Clara's breath caught slightly. Then we will make it worth finishing, she said. Something in his face settled then, the way a thing settles when it has been held up by tension for a long time, and the tension is finally allowed to go. He said, tell me your ideas. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and opened the ledger to a blank page at the back and began to draw. Not with Nora's precision, but with the rough clarity of someone who could see the shape of a thing before she knew all the details. He leaned forward to see. His shoulder was close to hers across the narrow table. I want to move the east-facing window, she said. Nora had it on the north wall, but if we bring it east, it catches the morning light all the way through to noon. He was quiet for a moment. Then show me on the drawing. She moved the pencil. He asked questions that were specific and useful, the questions of a man who had built things and knew what mattered. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the winter wind moved through the range in its long, low way. It was not a dramatic evening. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself. But somewhere in that hour, in the ordinary space of a kitchen table and a blank page and two people working something out together, Clara understood that this was what she had been hoping for without knowing she was hoping for it. Not the safety, though the safety was real. Not the room with the lock on the door, though she would never take that for granted. Something simpler and harder to name. To be in a room with someone and be simply plainly seen. The following Tuesday evening, she went to the barn later than usual. Ember was at the front of her stall when Clara came in the way she had taken to being in the evenings now. The weariness that had been in the mare's eyes when Clara first arrived had been replaced by something she had no better word for than simple trust. Straightforward and uncomplicated the way animals are when they have finally decided. Clara stood at the stall rail and thought about what that had taken. The weeks of evenings, the reading aloud of dry numbers, the not asking for anything while something was being built that could not be rushed and could not be forced and had to be given the exact amount of time it needed and not one moment less. She heard Eli's step at the barn door. He stopped when he saw her. He had that way of stopping without it being abrupt, the way a man stops when he finds something he was not expecting and takes a moment to understand what he is seeing. She turned to face him before she had entirely decided to. There is something I need to say, she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. I have been thinking about the arrangement, she said. You said at the beginning that anything beyond what we agreed would require that I be willing for it to change. She looked at him directly. I am willing. The barn was very quiet. Ember shifted behind her, entirely indifferent to the humans and their complicated inner lives. Eli was still for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he set his hat on the post beside the barn door and came across the aisle toward her and stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. "Clara," he said. His voice was careful in the way it was careful when he meant something so completely that the words had to be accurate. "I have been trying for weeks not to." He stopped. "I did not want you to feel any additional pressure, any sense that there was something expected of you beyond what you had agreed to." "I know that," she said. "That is why I am saying it and not waiting for you to." He looked at her for a long time with those steady brown eyes. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since about the fourth week." He said it the way he said things that were simply true, without decoration, without hedging. She breathed. "I did not know how to say this before," she said. "I have never had anything to compare it to. I did not trust my own." She stopped. "I trust it now." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just picked it up from where it was at her side and held it, and that was it. And it was the simplest and most significant thing anyone had done for her in her entire life. She looked at their hands and then up at him. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of people who had been waiting for the perfect moment. It was the kiss of two people who had waited long enough and finally stopped. Tentative for about a second, and then not. Ember snorted behind them. Clara broke away and laughed, actually laughed in the full unguarded way she had not laughed in front of another person in longer than she could remember. Eli smiled back the full version of the almost smile she had been catching glimpses of for months, and it changed his whole face. Both sides of it. "The mare has opinions," he said. "She always does," Clara said. They stood in the barn with her hand still in his, and the frost-sharpened evening coming through the open doors and the windmill turning outside, and neither of them said anything for a moment because they did not need to. January came to Harrow Range with a cold that meant business. Harlan Caldwell drove his wagon out from Millfield on a Wednesday morning with the paperwork and the patient efficiency of a man who had arranged many such things and believed in the institution. Eli had asked her this week before. In the kitchen after supper, hat in his hands, the thumb moving along the brim in the way she could not see anymore without something shifting in her chest. He had gotten about halfway through the question. She had said yes before he finished. He had stopped in the middle of the sentence and looked at her. She had looked back. That was the entirety of the ceremony that moment needed. Caldwell read them the formal language at the kitchen table. They signed. Cal Greer witnessed and afterward put one hand briefly on Eli's shoulder, a gesture so restrained and so genuine that Clara had to look at the window for a moment. Silas Pruitt had organized something in the bunkhouse. She was not certain when he had found the time. There was more food than 4 people could reasonably consume, and a warmth in the small space that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with what the people in it had decided they were to each other. It was loud and imperfect, and Eli did not know what to do with a celebration of his own making, and was stiff about it for the first hour until Cal said something dry and precise that broke it open, and Eli laughed in the full, unguarded way she had come to know. The laugh that changed his whole face. Both sides of it. She sat beside him and ate too much and watched the people around her and let herself feel it without managing it from a distance. This was what a life looked like from the inside, not a perfect life. She was clear about that. She knew the ranch's real numbers. She knew the hard winters ahead. She knew Eli's grief, which lived in certain silences she had learned to recognize and leave alone. She knew her own unfinished work with herself, the old reflexes that still occasionally surfaced, the bracing for things that no longer came. None of that was going away. That was not how people worked. But she also knew the south fence line she had helped repair in December, the herd healthy and moving into winter pastures on schedule, the kitchen with its reorganized shelves and its properly drawing flue, the accounts in better order than they had been in years. Ember standing in her stall with the specific confidence of a creature who had decided against all prior evidence that the world was not entirely against her. Cal had told her the week before that he was thinking of staying on permanently. He had said it the way he said most things, flatly, as though it were a logistical observation. She understood it was more than that. It was a man with 40 years of reading situations accurately telling her what he had read. Word had gotten around Millfield, the way word always got around in a territory where news moved on horseback and through general store conversation. People knew about Harrow Range now, knew it was running well. 2 neighboring ranch wives had come to call in October. She had made coffee and talked about cattle and winter preparation and the price of hay, and they had invited her to the settlement gathering in November, and she had gone with Eli, and she had spent 3 hours in conversation with people who talked to her as though she were simply a person at a gathering, which was still strange enough to notice and real enough to be glad about. The morning after the celebration, she woke early the way she always woke before the sun had done anything about the sky. She went downstairs and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window in the dark. The sky went through its changes the way it always did out here. Black to gray to the first thin color along the eastern horizon rising slowly over the range like something being carefully revealed. The cattle were a dark, patient mass in the winter pasture. The windmill turned its slow and reliable circle against whatever the sky decided to do. She heard Eli's boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and crossed to the stove and poured his coffee and came to stand beside her at the window. His shoulder settled against hers. Outside, the ranch was becoming itself again in the early light. Spring, he said, looking at the horizon. Not quite a statement, not quite a question. She looked at the bare framing of the east wing visible from this angle, waiting for what came next. The east wing, she said. He nodded once. I have been thinking about the window placement again, she said. If we frame it 18 inches further east than I drew it last week, the light hits the interior wall all the way to noon in January. Not just in summer. He was quiet for a moment. Then show me on the drawing tonight. All right. They stood at the window while the light built. The coffee was warm in her hands. The ranch woke up around them in its ordinary way. Somewhere near the barn, Silas appeared crossing the yard bucket, already threatening to escape his grip. From the bunkhouse, the low sound of Cal's voice talking to no one in particular, the way he sometimes did in the mornings. Clara looked out at all of it. She thought about this girl who had left Dry Hollow with a canvas bag that was not full, who had heard her brothers laughing through a thin wall and had written an address on a scrap of paper and put it in her boot, who had ridden 3 days west in a broken coach knowing she was the subject of a joke and had gone anyway. Not because she was unafraid, not because she knew how it would end, because she was more done with the alternative than she was afraid of the unknown. And because even after everything that had been done to extinguish it, something in her had refused to stop hoping. Something stubborn and inconvenient and apparently unkillable that had survived 24 years of a household designed to wear it down and had come out the other side intact enough to recognize what it was looking at when it finally found it. That girl was still here. She was still in Clara's hands when they shook still in the reflex that braced for things that no longer came. You did not leave yourself behind. You carried yourself forward, all of it. The damage and the stubbornness and the hard-won competence and the hope that had outlasted everything thrown at it. What changed was not who you were. What changed was what you walked toward. The sun broke over the eastern range. Fast and low and sudden, the way it broke in January, flooding the kitchen with flat gold light that lay across the floor in long, clean bars, reaching all the way to the far wall. Eli finished his coffee and put his cup in the basin and rolled up his sleeves and went out to start the morning. The same way he started every morning. Steady as the fence line. Reliable as the windmill turning against whatever the sky decided to do. Clara stood at the window one moment longer. Then she turned and went to work.